Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's me, David Robertson.
It's me, Christopher Cotter. And guten Tag, we should say. Wie geht's?
Guten Tag aus Bonn.
Yeah. We are recording in Bonn at the moment after having had an intense few days discussing the public rhetoric of good and bad religion. That's not what we're talking about today, though. Today we've got Brad Stoddard. It's an interview that you recorded quite a while back and it sort of fell through the cracks a little bit, but we're really glad to be able to bring it to you. Speaking to M. Cooper Harris about Ralph Ellison's Invisible Theology.
Take it away, Brad.
Hello, this is Brad Stoddard with the Religious Studies Project. Today I have the pleasure of talking with Cooper Harris. Cooper is an assistant professor of religious studies at Indiana University, and he just completed his first book titled Ralph Ellison's Invisible Theology, soon to be published with NYU Press. Cooper, welcome to the Religious Studies Project.
Thank you so much for having me, Brad. It's delightful to be here.
Thanks. Will you introduce your book to the listeners?
Yes, I'm delighted to. Thank you all for listening. Ralph Ellison's Invisible Theology is a book that examines what I would call overlooked or underappreciated religious and theological dimensions of the concept of race. The concept of race, as we now know it, emerges somewhere around the mid-20th century, where we have these two turns, one to a kind of materialism, on the other hand, a turn to critical theory. You have the rise of Black studies in the 1960s. You have the emergence of a kind of political sensibility, a mid-century political sensibility that defines race according to these terms. It has remained a popular way. I mean, a lot of the ways that we talk about, African American culture, the ways that we think about our current political process, the ways that we imagine the marginalization of people. We often do this in political, materialist, economic terms. What I'm interested in is the way that Ellison's term invisibility, Invisible Man, 1952 is his novel. The term invisibility has come to signify this kind of marginalization. If you go to your institution library and punch in invisible in a title search, you're going to get hundreds or thousands of titles back. Invisible women, invisible children in Houston schools, title after title after title that deals in terms of a kind of political materialist marginalization. That's great. My question becomes, why is it that invisible carries that valence when it also is, a metaphysical property? I might even say a ghost. These kinds of things. And so I work from that, and I think about how Ellison is actually working from an alternative understanding of racial dynamics in American culture, or even in the broader cultural systems of the West. He was very much at odds with the emergence of this definition of race. He is trying to think humanistically at a time when everybody else is turning to the social sciences. He's aghast at the Moynihan Report, which defines poverty and other sociological systems. He is dissatisfied with the kind of activist political mentality that goes into the production and the criticism of African American culture. And so what I see him doing is actually trying to work through this in an alternative way. And one way really to strike hard back at that materialist move is to think theologically. So what is it about race, about this concept of race, and for Ellison this means blackness? What is it about it that has an alternative kind of dimension? And so I began by looking at 4 or 5 ways of looking at an invisible man. We look at biblical invisibility, we look at invisibility among Puritan sources, Cotton Mather and Hutchinson. We look at Luther and Shakespeare. We move on to Congo religion and thinking about invisibility and death and the invisible powers and its relationship to racecraft. So how is witchcraft and racecraft this fantastic book by Barbara Fields, and I'm blanking on her sister, Karen. This wonderful book by Barbara and Karen Fields that compares the ways that many scholars think about race with a kind of magic, so racecraft, witchcraft, these kinds of things. On the other end, I look at more contemporary versions. Clint Eastwood's Empty Chair, drones. What are these kinds of, and I'm going to do my Gilbert Bond hands and say, but what are the spectacular imaginaries of the profound and scary secrets of this world that we live in, and how does something like the gaze of a drone that's chasing down some legacy of the colonized other, right, that is invisibly hovering here. I mean, what is the relationship between that and between what Ellison is understanding to be in play at the very end of the Jim Crow era? And in between that, I offer kind of a chronological assessment of Ellison's career using various lenses or methods that I draw from religious studies. I think about poetic justice, the notion of I think about the notion of poetic justice as it relates to racial identity in the Harlem Renaissance. I look at Invisible Man, published in 1952, in the context of three other important books that are out that year. One by Paul Tillich, The Courage to Be. One by Reinhold Niebuhr, The Irony of American History, and then Perry Miller's Errand to the Wilderness, which is published in 54, but actually delivered at Brown University in 52. I also uncover Ellison's close relationship with Nathan Scott. Nathan A. Scott Jr. Was a professor of theology and literature at the University of Chicago Divinity School. He and Ellison became great friends when Ellison was on a visiting assignment there. And what I found in their correspondence in Ellison's papers in the Library of Congress is that Scott recognizes a kind of sensibility in Ellison, a kind of religious sensibility. He tries to get him involved in what we would call religion and literature. He called it theology and literature. But he sees Ellison as a writer who is invested in these kinds of issues and questions. Ellison was also a huge fan of 19th century American literature. In fact, when he was asked to come teach places, he taught at Rutgers, he had a Schweitzer chair at NYU, he taught at Chicago, and had other sort of shorter appointments. They would also often assume famous African-American novelists would come in and teach, maybe African-American literature, but he would say, no, I want to teach a course on Civil War literature, or a course on 19th century American literature, which at the time was very a white core. I mean, he's drawing on larger influences, but he's also flummoxing a lot of the expectations. So he's teaching Melville and Hawthorne instead of these expectations. I'm also interested in how Ellison's second novel, which he never finished, he started writing almost immediately after Invisible Man was published in 1952. And he never finished it. He saved it for the last time on his computer, December 31st, 1993. He died in March of 94. He's writing and writing and rewriting. And he says that he's trying to capture something about race in America. The problem is he's doing it from roughly 1954 to 1994. He's doing it from basically Brown v. Board to the Million Man March. What does race in America mean during that period of time? Well, it's constantly changing. You can never get a hand on it. And so I use kind of changing dynamics of American civil religion as a way to pin down what it is that he's unable to capture, because he was invested in a highly centripetal understanding of what we would call American civil religion. I use the trope invisible theology in a couple of ways. On the one hand, it is the fact that this theological sensibility has largely escaped the attention of scholars. If you look at most writing that talks about Ellison at all, in what we would notice, or what we would call religious terms. It talks about his preachers, some, who are cultural figures, who may as well be jazz players. Not that that's not important, but it's a different thing. But nobody really understands him to draw on these kinds of this strong intellectual, historical, and cultural legacy. And so the invisible theology is the theological dimension that has not been seen, but also it is a theology of invisibility, which is to say that the condition of being Black in America, the concept of race itself, as a condition of invisibility, taps into a longer genealogy of a longer religious and theological genealogy of the concept of invisibility. And actually you can see ways that it passes through Ellison and is really helpful for understanding both the present and the future tense.
Are there any relevant biographical details about Ellison that we should know about?
I'm so glad you asked about the biographical details. One thing about him is that he falls outside of many of the major narratives that we use to talk about African American culture. Often we fall into the rural South, urban North binary. Ellison's from Oklahoma. He then enters into this migration through Alabama and Tuskegee, and then ends up in Harlem, where he lives the rest of his life. But he understands himself to be outside of the major migration narrative of the 20th century. And he's outside of many of the major arguments as well. He's not a social scientist. He dislikes that approach to culture. He feels like it's demeaning, that it takes away human elements. He believes that human beings are capable of extraordinary actions, even if they don't always and can't always fulfill them. And so he's a bit of an outlier. He becomes a bit of a pariah. He's sometimes called Uncle Tom. But he fights back and lashes back against that with I think, a very clear cultural sensibility, which is something like this. Whatever it is that our experience and our life is, and whatever the cruelty or the dispossession or the exclusion or the violence may be, there's a sensibility of blues, there's a sensibility of a kind of exception to these conditions, that we are human beings and we are meaning-making creatures. And there are ways in which we take these situations and view them with a kind of meaning that moves beyond the material realities of the presence. You might say that 65 years earlier, he's taking lemons and making lemonade, if you catch my drift.
I have a question about your methodology.
Yes.
Early on in the introduction, you identify Ellison as a secular writer. And methodologically, how do you get from secular writings to theology? How do you make that interpretive move? And what scholars of religion provide you the methodological tools to make that move?
Yes. So Ellison is what we call a secular writer. He had no specific religious commitments. He's not writing out of a specific tradition. He's not identified as such. And yet what I see is a kind of analogy here. I actually go to Schleiermacher, though I think we can think about it from Schleiermacher to Geertz through Durkheim and on. And what I'm interested in is this relationship between particularity and universality. Of course, Schleiermacher's definition of religion in the second discourse on religion to his cultural despisers defines religion as this kind of aggregation between universal and particular. And what I do is I take Ellison's concept of race, which race itself is, of course, a secular concept. It's one that comes out of this materialist moment. It's one that comes out of the social sciences in terms of its definition. And I say that actually what Ellison is doing with racial identity and within cultural expression is analogous to Schleiermacher's understanding, his definition of religion, that African American cultural expression is highly particularized for Ellison. It is what he grew up with. It's what he knows. It's what any person can gather from the kind of mother wit of their early existence and the ongoing interaction with other people and the world. It's highly particularized, and yet it also interacts with, corresponds to, comes into contact with, must negotiate a larger sense of being human. And so for him, the notion of the human is something of a universal. Now, what he wouldn't say is that the human, often this turns into the human is the white and the universal. He would say no. He would say that actually this set of correspondences kind of applies to everybody. He has a really lovely way of putting it. It's one of my favorites. He says, the Negro writer, which is his term, he says, the Negro writer writes out of a sense of a specific wound. The wound for us is the experience of being black in America. We can talk about slavery. We can talk about these other aspects. He says, but all novels deal with this kind of sensibility. All novels are about outsiders. All novels deal with a kind of wounding. All novels deal with, and I'm blanking on the specific term he uses here, but all novels are about, so what he says is that I write out of my experience, and I am creating something meaningful out of disaster, calamity, love, awesomeness, out of all of this, but it is directed specifically in my context. Ellison was often asked, why don't you write protest novels? By that, what the questioner would mean is, why don't you put in your novels that racism is bad and give very clear instances of that to display, to show it? And what Ellison said was, actually, every novel is a protest novel. All art protests against something. He says, for me, I write novels within my vernacular mode. And so that is a particular rendering of a more universal genre or form. But it's not unique to African American writers. Dostoevsky is protesting against the limits of 19th century rationalism. Don Quixote protests against the things that Cervantes is invested in. He goes back to Sophocles. He says, Sophocles is protesting against something. We may or may not know what it is, but what unites Sophocles and Shakespeare and Cervantes, to me, is that we are addressing something about a human condition, which Ellison understood to be a universal, that we have to enter through the highly specific, through a sense of particularity. And so what I say is that Ellison's understanding of literature, or even of cultural production, has this religious sensibility here. And so this is how the secular writer writes religiously. And then the question also becomes, so how does it become theology, right? And this, I see you smiling here, this is the religious studies podcast. One of the things I'm really interested in is, annihilating this hard, fast wall that's erected between theology and religious studies as these kinds of signifiers. And so one of the things that I say is that religion becomes the process. Theology becomes the meaning. So in other words, if the process is about the aggregation of the particular and the universal, the theology is what is the meaning that arises out of that. And what I hope that readers will see is a way that there's a kind of co-functionality between religion and theology, that they require one another to make sense of one another. And I don't mean this in a highly confessional sense, but I also think that there can be more an understanding and more interplay to be in play between them within the process. And I think Ellison gives us a fantastic vehicle for understanding that and seeing that.
Which contemporary scholars influence your methodological moves?
So I have a couple of clusters. I mean, there are two outstanding recent books. One is, two outstanding books that I look to. One is J. Cameron Carter's Race, Theological Account, which does the kind of deep excavation that I don't pretend to do, but that inspires me, right? That I'm trying to, it's a gesture to the hard digging that he's done. And in a way also of understanding the particularities of race to draw from these longer kinds of traditions. So again, it's not a universality per se, but it is something certainly more universal than we have previously imagined, longer legacies of race. Another one is Willie Jennings's The Christian Imagination. And I see these as, they may or may not be in actuality, but for me, I read them close together. And again, this kind of digging, this kind of excavative project that looks at the depth and resonance and meaning of this concept that has taken on more social scientific valences. I think two other scholars who strongly inspire me are Trixie Fessenden with her book, Culture and Redemption. And just in case I got it wrong, I'll say Trixie Fessenden with her book, Redemption and Culture. Because I see in my own project this a sense of having established the terms of social history, having established the terms of the kind of focusing in on not the grand narratives, but the smaller details, not focusing on the grand narratives, but in certain moments, and being sensitive to the exclusions that are caused by the grand narratives, and so then focusing on more of the micro histories. What she does, and I love this move, and it's so valuable. She says, okay, or what I understand her to be doing, and I love this move, is she's okay. So we have established that grand narratives are limiting because they exclude. So what happens if we create grand narratives that actually are built, that are built of this stuff that has been excluded? And that's what I see Carter doing, it's what I see Jennings doing in a way, and it's definitely what I want to do.
In the book, you recall a common question that is asked about Ralph Ellison, and that question is something along the lines of, is he a Negro writer, or is this a book about Negroes?
Yes.
That's some version of that question,
yeah.
right? What's at stake in that answer, or in the answer to that question?
Sure. And you did a nice job of synopsis of the two versions of that question. One is are you a Negro writer, or a writer who happens to be a Negro, or is this Invisible Man a Negro novel, or a novel that happens to be about a Negro? And then I think the question becomes, I mean, the way that I answer that question is yes, right? Because that is the particular, and that is the particular, that's Schleiermacher's two poles. What's at stake in the question is, I think, a sense of how you understand, or how you want to understand within this historical question, the historical people asking it, would have understood a Negro novel to protest, to offer to say very clearly, racism is bad, oppression is bad, I'm going to give you endless, horrific details that is going to illustrate this in so many ways, and then at the end I'm going to give you a nice little lesson, right? And that's overstating things, but something like Native Son, which is a much more complicated novel than that, but Ellison didn't necessarily see it that way. That would be the Negro novel. The novel that happens to be about a Negro. I think the problem with that question is that it underestimates the power of the particular. In other words, in saying that Invisible Man just happens to be about a Negro, it presumes that element, that the racial element, that the particularity is not important. And so somewhere between those two overdeterminations is where I think we should be looking, and that's where Schleiermacher's particulars and universals become important, because it's not about being particular. Nobody's all particular, nobody's all universal, right? We're all caught up in the midst of this messy cloud of identity. And for Ellison, that was precisely the point. And I think that is also what is so effective about this notion of invisibility, is that we're always constantly aggregating and changing, and there's a kind of sense of play that takes place within the process of identity formation, and within the production of culture through novels, but certainly other things as well.
Okay, thank you. Final question for you. We're conducting this interview. We're having this conversation in the early phase of the changes associated with President-elect Trump. Do you see any contemporary relevance to Ralph Ellison's Invisible Theology?
Yes, absolutely. I think for a couple of reasons. One, I think it shows, first of all, I think the fact that people are even remotely shocked at the outcome of this election shows how potent this concept of invisibility is. I mean, people were blindsided by it, and you listen to the responses, and it's economics, and it's this, it's that, it's the press, but at the end of the day, we exist within this kind of structure of reality that is very old, and that is sort of imbued with a kind of realness that permeates the culture. And so the fact that the kind of racial logic that has produced the results we see, I think, are in a different shade, perhaps a different hue, right? I mean, whiteness. Peter Urban had this great piece in the New York Times this weekend saying that whiteness is now a race. It's not just an unconscious thing. It's a race. And so we see this with the Invisible Theology, that whiteness has become, in a way, this kind of racial dispensation. And the election, I think, shows that for certain.
Okay. Well, thanks so much, Cooper. This has been a fantastic conversation, and let me compliment you. It is a superbly researched and a meticulously well-written book, and it's an enjoyable read. So congratulations on your first book, and thanks for your time.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me, and I hope that your listeners enjoy.
Thanks very much for that, Brad. Wonderful to hear from you again, and wonderful to hear about Ralph Ellison, who I must admit to having never heard of before that interview. It was great.
You'll be aware of The Invisible Man, though.
Yes, but now I can connect the dots.
Yeah. But lots of nice intersections there, ideas of race, of cultural production, the contextualization of thinking about religion at different, social circumstances in history. So, all good stuff.
Yeah, and thanks to Nasser for facilitating that as ever. Nasser are one of our sponsors, along with the BASR and the IAHR. So thanks to you guys. So we've just been spending a few days in Bonn discussing, as we said, the public rhetoric of good and bad religion. And we had promised you last week that we were going to be coming up with loads and loads of podcasts and everything. But one thing we promised was that you'd be hearing from us while we were here.
Yeah, well, we've done that. We've fulfilled that promise. We said we'd do some recording here, and we are recording. Yeah. Unfortunately, the schedule was just a bit too tight to...
Well, and intense. Yeah, we spent a few days discussing at length this rhetoric, and we thought initially we might do a roundtable on it, but after having spent 3 days discussing it, we thought we'd rather just enjoy dinner rather than recording another podcast.
But never fear, we have made lots of good contacts. We've got to meet a few people who have been involved in the project in one way or another in person. We've got to meet a few other people that we hope to be involved in the project in the future. And we've spoken to a few listeners as well. It's been a productive time, if not directly in terms of interviews.
Exactly. And so thanks to Adrian Herman and everyone at Bonn for a fantastic few days.
Next week, we've got an interview with another interview that Daniel Gorman's recorded for us, this time on the subject of evangelical yoga, which we'll talk a little bit more about next week. And that's an interview with Candy Gunter-Brown. So do come back for that.
Absolutely.
Thanks to our sponsors, the BASR, of course, but also the IAHR and the NAASR. Do remember to leave us a rating on iTunes, to check out our Facebook page, our Twitter feed. There might be a Google Plus. I don't know. There is a YouTube, and that's slowly picking up listeners there. Use our Amazon affiliate links if you want to support the project at no extra cost to yourself, or if you want to support the project at extra cost to yourself, you can do so at our Patreon link, which is patreon.com/projectrs.
That's the one. And don't forget to keep checking out the transcriptions of our podcast at religiousstudiesproject.com. I think that's about all for this week, David, except
That's right,
you know, the usual vielen Dank for listening.
For Huren.